The challenge to all businesses is not, can I have the best years of this person? Is, can I enable them to have multiple careers in this business?
Dames en heren, van harte welkom bij DenkTank, de podcast van Denkproducties waarin wij de leiders van Nederland helpen om nog beter te worden in hun werk. Mijn naam is Chris Kolen, co-host van de show en ik ben hier samen met Hans Jansen, oprichter van Denkproducties. En dit is een speciale aflevering, Hans, want wij gaan dadelijk schakelen naar het webinar wat wij hadden met Eliza Filby.
Ja. Dat
was een, wat zou je kunnen zeggen, een spraakwaterval van nuggets of wisdom.
Ja, zij is echt, ze komt uit Engeland, is ook echt zo'n mooi Brits accent. En zij heeft er een lekker tempo in. Je moet er ook echt even bij blijven. En heeft echt goede ideeën over hoe het eigenlijk is om met mensen van verschillende generaties op één werkvloer te werken. En hoe het eigenlijk komt dat we elkaar daar steeds moeilijker in kunnen vinden.
Ja, dus Dr. Eliza Filby is een Britse historicus, expert op het gebied van generatiedynamiek. En zij heeft een boek geschreven waarin ze ook heel veel data over, zeg even, de laatste 50 of 100 jaar erbij heeft gepakt. En ze kijkt dus eigenlijk over hoe ons werk, ons leven, ons consumeren, onze manieren van samenwerken veranderen in de tijd. En welke dynamieken daar ten grondslag onder liggen. Ze heeft eigenlijk geen oordeel, maar ze duidt eigenlijk die verschillen. En ze geeft ook tips over hoe je daarmee om moet gaan en hoe je de kracht van de verschillende generaties op de werkvloer kan gebruiken.
Ja.
En de reden dat wij dit webinar met haar hadden, dat is ook heel leuk, want zij is een van de sprekers op Amsterdam Business Forum. En volgens mij, jij hebt haar geselecteerd omdat zij jou ooit wegblies bij een ander optreden.
Ja, kijk, sowieso is het onderwerp van generaties op de werkvloer, daar wordt onwijs veel over gepost en geschreven en gevonden. En ik zocht eigenlijk nog steeds naar een hele goede spreker. Je hebt wel sprekers, hè? We hebben Laura Bas gesproken, maar die is dan van een generatie. Maar je wil eigenlijk iemand hebben die dat in perspectief kan zetten. En Eliza, die hadden wij een keer voor een sessie voor de Nederlandse Bank. En op aanraden van onze collega's uit Oslo. En zij was echt magistraal. En daar zit dan bij de Nederlandse Bank zit echt de top 100. Hè? Dus die willen altijd goed volk op anders gaan ze gewoon weg.
Ja.
Dus die zijn echt positief kritisch. Maar die wilden meer. Dus dat is echt leuk.
Heel goed.
Ja.
Je gaat dadelijk luisteren naar eigenlijk een mini-college van Dr. Eliza Filby, ongeveer 20 minuten. Daarna halen we nog een aantal vragen naar het podium van de mensen die het webinar aan het kijken waren. En je gaat zien, dit is één brok kennis die jou op een hele toegankelijke manier meeneemt in de dynamiek van generatieverschillen. Dr. Eliza Filby.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, listen, thank you, guys. I think it's really important to stress how central to the sort of whole debates around hybrid working, generational change, generational difference actually is. But before I go into all of that, I just want to say the 3 hours that I spent with the Dutch Central Bank in that wonderful workshop in Amsterdam were actually quite pivotal, intellectually quite important for me, actually, because it was a fascinating engagement with a really important institution where actually there was a lot of people that had worked in one organization their entire professional lives. And there was so much wisdom in the older generations that needed to be passed down to the younger generations. And I think we forget and we obsess actually about younger generations and what they need and what they're not perhaps giving us and why they're so difficult to manage and why we challenge, why we think they're different from us. And I remember that workshop as being really actually one that was incredibly positive about the role that older generations have in learning from younger generations. So what do? I'm a historian, right? And I'm motivated. I grew up in a multi-generational household. I have my grandparents who've been through the Second World War. I have my parents who've been through the radical years of the 60s and 70s. And then there was me growing up in the 80s and 90s. And we were all really products of a distinct time. And one of the things that really struck me growing up in a 3-generation household is that we all had very different values. We all had different ways of doing things. And that interaction with multiple generations from a young age really shaped my interest in how we are all a product of our time. And actually, I would say there's something that happens to human beings around the age of 30 to 35, where we realize we're no longer young. And we realize that young people feel very alien and a bit weird and frankly a bit annoying. And so you can see this in workplaces. You can see just now as millennials enter midlife and managerial positions, they're finding Gen Z actually quite different to them, different in their digital habits, perhaps in their adoption of AI, definitely in terms of their much more sort of segmented view of work and life, much more sort of fluid in their attitude towards their career, and much more engineered towards a much more individual-centric view of life, right? And equally, there's a real difference between millennials and Gen X and baby boomers, right? Baby boomers grew up in quite deferential households in the aftermath of the Second World War, quite hierarchical workplaces where you still had, male-only spaces. You still had mandatory high heels for women. You still had army of typists typing everything, mostly women generating all the bureaucracy for the male leaders. And then Gen X were the first kind of tech generation, were the Sony Walkman kids when they were younger. And then they were the kind of Crackberry, Blackberry adults, the first generation to have tech in the workplace. They were the first generation to see women outnumber men at university, and that generation of women entering the workplace and really breaking down the professional boundaries around gender. And so it's a very different experience. And obviously, not to mention the end of the Cold War. Millennials saw the Eurozone crisis and the financial crisis just as they were entering the workforce. Gen Z were defined, I think, really by COVID and how flexible working wasn't anything but mandatory, So all of this sort of shapes us. It shapes us. It doesn't define us, but we're not talking stereotypes here, but it shapes us. We are undeniably defined by different times. And so the way this plays out in the workplace is that the older you get, actually the less willing you are to understand someone born in a different time. We're much more in the workplace likely to be friends with someone of a different gender, race, religion than as someone of a different generation, right? There's a real generational gap. Now, it's causing friction. So different ways of working, different expectations around management, communication, even retirement. It's causing friction, low-level friction. That kind of feeling of, that really annoys me. But on a much bigger level, it's also causing real tension and retention issues. Because if your older people don't feel listened to or feel silenced or feel forgotten, they will go. If your young people don't feel like they're learning, don't feel like they're being listened to, or don't feel they're being cared for, they will go. So these generational tensions may seem small, but actually decrease productivity, really impact your bottom line, because ultimately you will lose people if they are not integrated. And every workplace needs that sort of entrepreneurial, disruptive spirit of youth and that experience and wisdom of your older workers. You need both, and you need to connect both, and you need to connect them ever more in a workplace dominated by AI and hybrid working, where we're seeing each other less. There's less of that spontaneous learning, observation, conflict resolution, communication. All of that is being lost in the hybrid era. Now, I'm someone that works from home and a mother of two who absolutely loves hybrid working. However, we need to admit what is being lost by not connecting and seeing each other, particularly across the generations, right? And in an age driven by AI adoption, that is a real business risk, because what you're doing is that quite often AI is replacing, and it's replacing certain functions, but not the learning function, which is arguably one of the most important things that we need to transmit in the workplace. I think it's a broader question, though. It's not just poking and picking out different generations. It's also about really understanding how work and our relationship with work is changing. Because I'm interested in change, right? So whilst it's about generational tension and gaps, it's also about change. So as I said, gone are the days when you had a career for life. Now, certainly you will not have a career for life, okay? There are estimations that Gen Z will have over 17 different employers over their working life and 5 different careers, okay? So the workplace is becoming more fluid. We're not moving jobs as much, but certainly we're already seeing impact of AI in entry-level jobs, the way in which we're going to have to constantly upskill and shift, somewhat out of personal need and desire, but also quite often out of pivoting because of financial need as well. That's the first thing. The second thing is the workplace was built on a system built, frankly, for men and male breadwinners, right? So this idea is you had your education, you had your work life, and then you had your retirement. Well, to be honest, that's only really 150 years old. But it was also one that was built for women to do most of the care. Now, women haven't stayed at home, but they have always worked. But certainly the expectation around care was that there was a male breadwinner and a female carer. Now, in the 21st century, you have girls outperforming men and boys at university, right? So the best educated in society are women, number one. Number two, you now have, in many instances, in major cities and in major sectors, women out-earning men in their 20s, right? So girls and women are outperforming boys and men, which is causing, some say, the crisis in masculinity. But there is a broader point here, is that the real gender pay gap happens if women have children. So it's actually not a gender pay gap, it's a pregnancy penalty, right? Because the system was built for women to be at home and men to be in work. But what's happened is in Gen X and millennials, and now you're seeing what Gen Z is, women have contorted their fertility into a career cycle built for men. So women are having fewer children, they're having them closer together and having them later in life. So what you've got now is women have risen in their economic contribution to the household. Yay, story of positive progress. Men are now rising in their domestic contributions to the household, which is why fatherhood's become more important. And not just fatherhood, millennial fathers are doing more childcare, changing more nappies, pushing more prams than any generation of fathers before them, because they have to, because the economics of marriage have changed. But also what's critical is that elder care is the real issue for millennials, because Europe is an aging continent. The median age of a European is 45 years old, right? We are living in an aging society where we're not just looking after our kids if we have them, we're looking after our parents. So we have a real challenge here, is that the care in society, which is traditionally done by women, now is slightly confused, right? And you have a critical challenge with elder care, because you are losing a lot of older women to looking after their parents, or sometimes looking after their in-laws. So all that female talent you've promoted in their 50s, you may be risk of losing because of the family complications around elder care, something a lot of companies are not thinking about. So what we're saying here is the challenge of learning in an AI-driven workplace. We can't have one career. We need a workplace that is like a campus, constantly upskilling, enabling us right through to our 60s and 70s to be constantly upskilling. The challenge to all businesses is not, can I have the best years of this person, is can I enable them to have multiple careers in this business? The second challenge is the care challenge, and the way in which we are really at a fundamental pivoting point around who is responsible for care in the family and in the home. It's not just women anymore. It's as much as men's responsibility. And number 3 is growing individualism. More and more people live alone. Fewer and fewer people are thinking less, what's my loyalty to the company? What is my individual ambition? Okay. And a really good way of illustrating this in 1952, an American psychologist ran an experiment asking Americans, how important do you think you are? How important a person do you think you are? And quite strikingly, just 12% of Americans at that time in 1952 said, I'm an important person. The experiment was run again in 1990, right? So this is really, it was not asking millennials. It was not asking Gen Z. The experiment asked boomers, Gen X, and the generations that were still alive before them. 80% of people in 1990 thought they were an important person. Now, the experiment was run again in 2020. 98% of people said they were a really important person, right? So the road to hyper-individualism through our phones, through our schooling system, through frankly, smaller families, has meant that we now consider work in a sense of self-fulfillment rather than corporate loyalty, right? And that isn't something you can blame young people for. It's endemic across all society. And you have to create a system that basically stops putting people on a conveyor belt. And you're already seeing a rebellion amongst the 50-somethings in your company who are thinking, where's my purpose? Is this it? Do I want any more from life? Because I haven't got much energy left. I haven't got many decades left to contribute to society and build my legacy. And so you're seeing that individualistic rebellion already in Gen X. And it will be even worse in millennials and even more profound in Gen Z. And finally, in all of this, the question really is, what do we do about it? What do we as individual managers or juniors or leaders do about, firstly, navigating this change in the workplace? Because it's the demographic shift is as big as the AI shift, right? But then what do we do as a company about this shift in generational friction, but also critically in people challenges? Now, number one is raise your awareness. Raise your awareness around the issues around demographics, the different generations, what Gen Z are requiring, what they're experiencing, how they're seeing the world, what TikTok's saying about your company, what they are really ingesting around even your profession, your sector, your business. Really immerse yourself, because what you're doing in raising that awareness is you're getting rid of your prejudice. Because I bet, as we all do, is we tend to be stereotypical, we tend to blame, we tend to point finger and get really lazy when we talk about young people, right? So number one is raise your awareness. Make a point of being curious rather than condemnatory. What are these young people thinking? How is it different from mine? How was their career, education, childhood different from mine? Did they have a job? Did they go through COVID? Were their parents still together? Were they born in this country? All of those things have fundamentally changed in the last 30, 40 years. So raise your awareness. Number two, and this is a really critical point, is this is about asking the right questions. Is start the conversation. Don't think you have all the answers, but start the conversation with your elders and with your juniors, okay? So if you are a Gen Zer, realize that the most important thing you can do for your career is get to know your elders. They will be the making of your career. They will be the defining opportunity in your career. So number one is have those conversations that are based in curiosity rather than procedure. So ask your elders, what was it like when you started at this company? Tell me about your career path. Really open that dialogue between the generations. And it's the same with elders. It's the same with middle management and leaders. Middle management are particularly important in this dialogue because they are the bridge between the juniors and the leaders. And they have to really speak to both generational ends and cross that digital analog divide. And then the third thing is I would really understand how society is changing at a macro level. And this is the changing care requirements, the changing position of women, the changing position of men, the changing impact that AI is having on human intimacy, human connection, human wisdom, human knowledge acquisition. All of these things are hugely impeding and exceeding these human relationships in the workplace. And being a real student, a real curious student of how macro trends and your own micro interactions really help you understand the true challenge of an intergenerational workplace.
Wow, it's just amazing. We see you there sitting on the stairs, and she just gives a talk like she was on the main stage.
Nuggets of wisdom are flying around.
Yes.
Very nice.
Thank you very much. While we have a first question, perhaps it's good to ask our viewers to submit questions in the YouTube chat, because they can still do so. We have one question that I think actually has been answered along the way, but let's just do it perhaps as a wrap up for what you've just been sharing. It's a question from Hannah. She says, what's the most urgent behavioral shift that leaders must make to connect with the younger generations, and what's holding them back the most? Perhaps the second part is the most interesting, because the first one...
Yes, it's a brilliant question. It is the question. Thank you for it. Because what's holding us back is we are preoccupied with what we have learnt, right? So, for example, telephone etiquette. Why can't young people answer the phone? Why can't they talk to clients on the phone? Why can't they cope with me phoning them? Because they grew up with the phone like that, not like that, without a landline, right? And you grew up in maybe the 80s or 90s where you learned to talk to your parents' friends before, your friends' parents before you could speak to your actual friends. That etiquette around telephones did not exist in the 1890s, right? They existed in the 1990s, but not the 1890s. So all of these sort of universal truths around work are things that you learnt and that you expect people to know automatically. And you patronize them or maybe condemn them for not knowing that. But actually, you need to kind of think outside your time and think, do you know what? When I was young, that came naturally to me. What is it that I know naturally that they don't have a clue about? And what do they know naturally that I don't have a clue about? And so in that sense, for example, using ChatGPT for managerial advice would be something that someone in their late 20s would find quite natural. Someone in their late 50s would find, frankly, really bloody odd. So it's like really understanding I'm programmed to think things have always been this way because it's all I've actually known, when actually things have not always been anyway at all, and things have always changed. And therefore what you want to do is start working out what's natural to you but unnatural to them, and what's natural to them and unnatural to you. And that is about being curious rather than labeling.
Very good. When you were writing your latest book, you were obviously doing a lot of research. Can you share some of the insights that came from this research that surprised you the most?
Yes. So sort of two really important things. Number one is we're extending adolescence, right? The average parent expects to be funding their kid until the age of 30, right? So parenting has become more expensive, which is really important to understand for your 50-somethings, for 20-something age kids. And also it's really hard to motivate young people with a big wage, because they haven't the responsibilities in the same as early, mortgage and kids basically, as perhaps you did. So even motivating, your early 30-somethings with salary alone might not work, because, the age at which women are having their first child is going up and up and up. So money tends to be a huge motivator. The more responsibility you have, and the more the deeper you go into adulthood. So delayed adulthood. And secondly is that impact of the bank of mum and dad, how parents are now funding their kids, getting much more involved in their education, much more involved in their early work placements, much more involved in their careers, much more, and this is really since the 2008 financial crisis, many more adults in their 20s and early 30s still living at home, more men than young women, interestingly. And this this what I call the bank of mum and dad is in many respects extending adolescence and infantilizing young people, but it's also a product of economics because, the cost of certain things have gone up, whether you're talking about rents in big cities, housing more broadly, the cost of childcare, the cost of education, but it's also the desire for more freedom in our younger years and extending that freedom for as long as we possibly can, especially women. And so it's a positive story, but it's also an infantilizing one. And that was the most interesting aspect for me when I was researching the book, because actually it's part an autobiography. It's part my own story of relying too much on the bank of mum and dad and not really thinking of how I should get my act together and become an adult.
Okay.
Nice.
Yes.
I think this individualism you are talking about is really big part of the bigger shift. Mm-hmm. And we have a question from Jos. He says, okay, you say we have to be curious about the other generation, but the individualism is kind of the paradox in this whole shift, I guess.
100%. I mean, to be honest, we are all really bad at empathizing with each other that are different, with other people that are different from us. We've got worse at it. We haven't got better. And that's partly because the hyper-individualism that is evident in our phones and on social media, obviously. It's also the fact that we talk a lot about allyship, but fundamentally it's often allyship with people that are just like us. And it's very difficult to listen to things that we don't agree with. And I think that's partly because we are built to think through technology, through changing parenting culture, and through the culture of self-help, to believe in the self-autonomy, self-identity, self-actualization. And that has positives, but it also has profound negatives. And I don't think we can be naive to the impact that this has on the workplace. Now, COVID ushered in a period and an extended period that we're obviously still now in of hybrid working, in which we are colliding less, we are seeing each other less. And there's huge consequences to that. We can't be in denial of that. It's given certainly mothers, I would say, in particular, more flexibility, and that should be welcomed. But I think the broader consequence is socialization and friendships in the workplace are happening less. Learning, particularly across the generations, is happening less. Communication, conflict resolution is happening less. And over-dependence on tech, under-dependence on human connection is happening, certainly. Now, I'm a great advocate that when you're in the office, you should have a policy that actually you are connecting with the other humans in the office, not sat on Zoom tuning in to other people that are not there. Like, that's terrible. When you're in the office, that's the point of connection. And I've worked with businesses and where they have deliberately institutionalized a lunch hour where people sit and have lunch, break bread, that the communal interaction in the workplace is being lost. And it's not just because of COVID. It used to be that most people met their partners, their romance partners in the workplace. And that has rapidly declined in the last 20 years. And I think that I'm not saying that we should falsify social interaction. It's got to be natural. It can't be weird water cooler moments that are enforced. But I think injecting time, space, investment in human beings getting together is really important. Now, let me say, in the age of AI, it's going to be all about counting productivity and measuring productivity and making human time count. The problem is I'm advocating businesses doing stuff they can't count, because you can't count listening to someone else, the productivity of listening to someone else do a client call. Yeah. How do you count that? Like, what's the measure point? And so in essence, what I'm saying is that let AI do the boring stuff that actually, frankly, humans don't actually like, email, and let humans do what they do best, which is care, which is communicate and convince and build trust and teach. And that is about the reorientation of a human-centric workforce in a digital age. And any business that does that, I genuinely think will be successful in the age of AI.
What a great wrap-up. Is that also what you're going to talk about on with our audience on the 26th of September?
Yes, we're going to be talking about that and a lot more. And in particular, how it's played out in different sectors. In particular, really the practical elements of all of this. What can businesses do? Is it reverse mentoring schemes? Is it more paternity leave? Is it, various aspects, policies? What's worked well and what hasn't worked well? And really, can we benchmark that as best practice to bridge that generational divide? And for anyone interested, obviously in my speech, be there, but also more generally in my work, obviously do buy my book. But I have on my website a free diagnostics tool, which is called the Multi-Generational Advantage Scorecard. And really, it takes 10 minutes to fill out. It's free to fill out. It's a diagnostics tool that helps businesses understand how big or small their generational gap is by benchmarking across and comparing with businesses, and best practice across the world.
That's great. We'll add it to the video link so people can don't have to search for it, but can just click on it. We'll just service them right away. Eliza, we really need to thank you very much for being so flexible, sitting on the stairs, giving us a lecture from there, and doing it if you can do a talk like this.
On the stairs. With technical instability.
What will happen?
I was in and out.
It will bring you to a stage with 2,500 people and everything on it that you can only hope for that is taken care of. So we will make sure we have a different setting next time. And we're now even more convinced that it's going to be super, super interesting and very inspiring. And we really look forward to having you in later this year. Awesome.
Really looking forward to it, guys.
Yeah, we planned it on the Friday, so you can stay for the weekend. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a great, great day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Je hebt geluisterd naar Dr. Eliza Filby over, wat hebben we eigenlijk niet behandeld. Het waren heel erg veel topics met als rode draad. Ja, hoe werken eigenlijk de generatieverschillen door op de werkvloer? En Hans, hoe kijk jij hierop terug? Wat heb jij eruit gehaald?
Ja, nou kijk, wat natuurlijk in dit onderwerp heel vaak gebeurt, is een beetje karikatuur. Hè? Dus de Gen Z'ers die om 4 uur naar huis willen, want ze moeten naar een festival en ze durven niet te bellen. En dat wordt dan gezegd door boomers die nog steeds met 2 vingers typen. Maar zij is heel erg van het overbruggen van verschillen. En hoe doe je dat dan? En hoe werkt dat dan? En wat ik echt dan nieuw vond, ik dacht van, maar waar komt het dan door? En als ze dan bijvoorbeeld zegt van ja, de huidige jonge mensen, die hebben eigenlijk de kans om echt volwassen te worden, krijgen ze relatief laat. Ze gaan laat trouwen, hebben laat kinderen, kunnen eigenlijk pas heel laat op zichzelf gaan wonen. Dus eigenlijk wat je normaal gesproken als mens leert door in het diepe gesodemieter te worden, dat hebben mensen nu pas laat. En dat nemen ze ook mee naar hun werk. En dan dacht ik, damn, dat wist ik gewoon. Ja, nu je het zegt, denk ik, ja, dit klopt.
Ja, het is heel mooi omdat zij dus historicus is. Kan zij dus het gedrag wat je ziet en wat je herkent in een historische context plaatsen. Waardoor je ineens ook dat gedrag veel beter gaat snappen.
Ja.
En je eigen gedrag vind je natuurlijk super logisch. Want dat is hoe jij bent opgegroeid en hoe jij de wereld ziet. En de technologie die jij altijd hebt gehad. Maar de mensen die voor jou of na jou komen, die zijn opgegroeid in een andere context. En ik denk dat we daar te weinig bij stilstaan. En dat is inderdaad mooi hoe dat zij eigenlijk zegt, maar wacht even. Als je nou eens kijkt door die bril en die context, dan ga je dat gedrag veel beter snappen. En dan kan er in één keer toch veel meer samenwerking aan ontstaan.
Ja. En er zit met dus de oproep erbij om gewoon echt met elkaar in gesprek te gaan en vragen, hoe zie je dat? Waar komt dat vandaan? Waarom vind je dit? In plaats van
ik vind dat normaal gesproken altijd een beetje een soort plat of flauw advies. Dan denk je, no shit Sherlock.
Ja.
Maar op de manier hoe dat zij haar verhaal opbouwt en vanwege al die context en die data die ze daarbij gebruikt, denk ik, daar heeft ze toch wel een vrij goed punt.
Ze heeft wel een punt, hè? Ja.
En 26 september gaat zij natuurlijk nog veel dieper. Zij staat op de mainstage op Amsterdam Business Forum. En dat wordt helemaal geweldig. Volgens mij zijn de laatste tickets... Hoeveel mensen zijn er?
Ja, we zitten nu al dik boven de 2000 en er kunnen er 2500 in. En we weten dat normaal gesproken in de zomer... Dat lijkt een luwe tijd, maar er hebben heel veel mensen waarschijnlijk nog in hun agenda staan alvast. Maar nog geen kaartje geboekt, want misschien komt er iets belangrijks tussen. Dus we zien altijd in juli, augustus, september toch nog een flinke bult inschrijvingen. Dus als het zo doorgaat, dan zijn we rond begin september vol.
Lekker.
Lekker toch? Ja.
www.denkproducties.nl als je erbij wil zijn. En vergeet niet te abonneren op deze podcast en stuur deze aflevering door als je het interessant vond. Dankjewel voor het luisteren.
Yes.